So Lindsay, I know your OurSociety profile, you talk a lot about education and your views on education. Why don't you share that with everyone at home?
So the phrase that you hear a lot is that education is the great equalizer, and I truly believe that a reformed education system, reformed from what we have now, would be a great economic equalizer. The thing is that in order to reform our education system, we can't just reform elementary education or postgraduate education. We really need to look at the whole system, because right now the system is very broken at all levels. I'd like to start out with a universal pre-K that starts at age 3. I realize that trying to fund something like that can be tricky, but if we can improve the education system, ultimately the economic gains will lead to paying for the program itself. So we start with universal pre-K, we work our way through reforming the elementary education to take focus off of standardized testing and focus more on growing social skills among children, and then we eventually work their way up to a more knowledge-based curriculum with no standardized testing until the end of high school. And then at the high school level, we shouldn't just be teaching straight academics. We need to go back to teaching home ec. We need to go back to teaching how to balance a checkbook and keep a household budget. Every single school in the country needs to be teaching civics, because right now the fact that I actually got a civics education in high school is an anomaly, and that's terrifying. And I would like to see every high school graduate with not just a high school diploma, but also a trade certificate. I believe that the high school program can be tailored in such a way that you're learning the academics that you need to succeed, the common sense life skills that you may or may not learn at home, and a trade that can make you economically viable and allow you to truly have a choice whether you want to continue on to college or not.
Yeah, those are a lot of really interesting points. I'm actually a fan of education reform as well, and I think there's a couple of things you mentioned. One, the transfer of education to the current kind of encyclopedic memorization to a more dialectic form of education. You having the ability to communicate, I mean, that is the true entrance to the knowledge economy, right? Because there's so many things that, back when I went to high school, which is not that long ago, right? It's probably similar for you, that you're kind of in this memorization, academic, cram, and that is just not preparing us for the reality of the world. So a more dialectic education, even from a young age, kind of teaching cooperation instead of, for example, competition, right? Even I find fault to some extent, and I think this is good to explore, is even like the grading system, it creates a system of hierarchy, right? Which the system of hierarchy is a reflection of the mass manufacturing plants of old, where you went in, you were a laborer, you do what you were told, and so forth and so on. But the reality is that every individual has different strengths and abilities to manifest those strengths given the opportunity, right? Now, I am curious, how would you, we talk about funding as a challenge. I don't want, I have some perspectives, but I'd love to hear yours. What do you think about, how do we change what is the major problem in education funding today? What is a big challenge holding us back from that?
Where do I begin? So at least in New Jersey, the biggest challenge is that what is funding our public schools is our local property taxes, for the most part.
Sure.
Which, they vary depending on what town you live in, what county you live in, and they are all being pooled at the county level and then redistributed to the public schools, but there's a lot of unaccounted for dollars there. So, my property taxes are really high, and that's something that I wouldn't be able to necessarily affect as a congressperson, but my property taxes are really high, and some of that is going into education, but my local school system is having funding problems despite our taxes going up every year. So we need to put in some, I know a lot of people panic when they hear regulation, but we need a little bit more regulation of how funds are being spent on school in the first place. Because we spend an enormous amount of money per pupil, allegedly, but it's not netting out in the outcomes of our education.
So, yeah, and that's the U.S. does spend a lot. We know that, and we know the outcomes also, are producing. So it is interesting. I think one of the things you mentioned, and it's across the nation, local municipality taxes fund public schools. In fact, I read a statistic the other day, a little less than 50% of all property taxes go to funding public education. So I wonder if the solution, we talk about like changing property taxes on the congressional level, is it possible that we're just looking at it the wrong way? Like maybe the problem is that exact thing you mentioned. Maybe we just need to decouple education spending from municipality taxes.
Yeah.
Right, and kind of have a kind of more national education program where the federal, state, and local governments cooperate.
Yes.
In a form where we focus on education, and then we even have a program where if we have a failing school, for example, there is a pathway for whether it be the state or the federal government to come in, you take over the school for a year or two, fix it, and then hand it back to the community, so to speak. And that can also be done. Technology is providing us ways to kind of disseminate best practices. So there's ways that we could interlink the schools that are much deeper and more connected than they are now. To kind of make sure that is a thing. And why, it's obvious that Lindsay's passionate about this, you may be catching my passion as well, but I really believe that education is the cornerstone of a good democracy, right? And I think for those of us who are stressed with the way things are, it's very apparent that education has played a factor in the reason we are in the situation we are now. And that's no fault of the people, I want to make that clear. But when you have education rate tied to property taxes, you create a system of perpetual poverty, which bad education lowers your future earning potential, which creates poverty, which creates less schools, money for the schools, rinse and repeat indefinitely, right? And it's no wonder that we have a failing education system. So,
right. And the thing is that it really ties into the economy too, is if we're not producing adequately educated workers, we're failing our economy too.
Sure.
So the onus really ought to be on employers as well to champion improved education, because that's who they're employing. They want well-educated employees, and they should be providing continuing education resources, and they should be also, until we have a better educated system, they ought to be willing to fund the kind of training and education needed to get employees up to where they need them to be.
Yeah, that is a very, I think, enlightened perspective. Professor Roberto Unger from Harvard talks a lot about that, and he essentially talks about how the best companies will eventually become the best schools. And in a world of 2018, right, and anything beyond, constant relearning is part of being part of the knowledge economy. So the only way we're going to increase the economy per se is disseminate those practices of constant learning to all sectors of the economy, to have it kind of function as the knowledge economy. Really, really great perspective. That's really interesting.